Now for our first conversation, Dangerous Technology. Joining Michael, please welcome panelists Cindy Cohn, Executive Director, EFF, and Jim Zemlin, Executive Director, Linux Foundation.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you so much to Jim and Cindy for joining us. Again, virtual round of applause. I feel like perhaps it's my own mistake that the framing of the event in a way that I kind of positioned you guys as sort of representative of how we got here, when in fact you're both still very, very active in helping build and create the internet of today and the future. So I feel like I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't start off by acknowledging your continued and future work. However, I do want to make sure that we have the opportunity to learn as much as we can from your past experience for our audience of future builders. To do that, I'd love to start with you, Cindy, because I love the role that you played in history in sort of helping us get access to a little thing called cryptography. It's such a crucial and fundamental part of everything that we do today. It's hard to believe that somebody at one point in time had to fight for that right. Could you just take us back in time to before the moment that you know I'm alluding to, and tell us a little bit about this era when cryptography was classified by the U.S. government in the same category as nuclear secrets. Why did this happen? How did we end up in a world where cryptography and nuclear secrets were considered protected with the same legislation?
I think this is an area where technology's development kind of encroached upon something that had been envisioned as largely a military thing, right? Caesar had a cipher, right? You could probably even go back earlier and find people speaking in secret codes to each other. And anybody who's a historian of World War II knows that our ability to break the German codes with the Enigma machine was one of the turning points in the war. So, and we also broke the Japanese codes as well. So I think what really the reality is that our technology ended up encroaching on something that had been kind of largely a military thing. We know that Jefferson and Madison spoke to each other. Jefferson had his own cipher, and they spoke to each other in code when Jefferson was in Paris and Madison was here writing, some of the founding documents. So it's always had a political and again military role. What happened was, as we developed digital technology, it became clear that this technique of secret codes could be, used very well by computers, not a surprise, but that would really be a key to us having security and privacy in this digital age. And so I think the fact that it ended up on the U.S. munitions list next to surface-to-air missiles and nuclear weapons is not particularly surprising. I think what was hard was to convince the government that the rest of us needed encryption too.
So this is a long and fabulously interesting story. I want to ask you if you can try and condense it, because it's great to hear it in the people who were there's own words. In about 2 minutes, can you kind of just give an audience an overview of the role that you played in helping change that paradigm?
Well, I want to be really clear. There were a lot of people involved in changing that paradigm, but I was lucky enough to get asked by the Electronic Frontier Foundation to do a litigation challenge, to go to the courts and to try to convince the courts that we had to do a couple of things. The first thing we had to convince the courts of was that computer code was speech for purposes of the First Amendment, that coding was a rarefied language that we use to explain things to each other in a technical audience, but also to a computer, and to get a computer to execute on them. So once we did that, so we put together a lawsuit. I represented a guy by the name of Dan Bernstein, who's a cryptographer. He was a grad student at the time. He's now a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And a pretty famous cryptographer. But he wrote a really dumb little program called Snuffle, that if you're technical, I could explain what it does, but it's not a particularly insightful thing. And I would recommend, impact litigation around something that is going to change the world. You might want to think about a different strategy. But so we went to the government and we said, Dan wants to publish this thing on the internet. Can he do it? And the way the regulations work is you send a request into the government, and then they might get back to you. So about a year later, he still didn't really get a response. And then we pushed and he got a no from them. And so we sued and we said, look, telling a professor that he can't publish code on the internet is a First Amendment problem. It requires you to meet the First Amendment standards. And these regulations aren't even close. And we won. The district court agreed. There were a lot of shenanigans along the way, but ultimately by the end of it, we were winning, and the government did kind of a slow surrender. So now, and it worked over time, but now you can use very strong encryption, and the government still, has a very light regulation where you have to email them, but otherwise that's why Zoom can be encrypted right now.
I love it. And I think you nailed that. That was about 2 minutes, maybe a little over. Thank you so much. I'm impressed. Jim, so I want to switch gears a little bit here. You are the executive director of the Linux Foundation, which is probably the most important organization that a lot of people have never even heard of. And so I want to start not with what is the Linux Foundation, because I think that kind of misses the point. In as lay terms as possible, could you try and take a stab at defining the Linux kernel, and how is it that it is powering so much of what we consider the internet today?
Yeah, I mean, the Linux kernel is the center of most major computer operating systems. So whether it's an Android device, almost all server-side software. So whether you're in a big data center running your company's code, or you're using Amazon or Facebook or Google, or you're trading stock, all of that software runs on the Linux operating system. The kernel is the part that allocates compute, network, storage resources, and really enables the operating system. It's the heart of the operating system. And, today it really is in, probably 90% of the world's computers. It's the vast majority of embedded systems, mobile devices, servers. The Chrome desktop is a good example of Linux. It just really is something people use every single day. They may not even know it.
And so I want to sort of bring those two stories together and talk about the fundamental role that cryptography plays in our modern day internet, and the fundamental role that the Linux kernel plays in our modern day internet. And perhaps more importantly, the fact that neither of those projects were closed source. Like, you weren't necessarily asking, how do I monetize this? You were creating something for the world to use. So I'd like to just an open question to you all. How do you sort of shepherd that technology once it is out there in the wild? What roles do you play to help ensure that it stays open, stays available to businesses and individuals around the world?
I'm happy.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I mean, EFF, I'm a lawyer. EFF works in law and policy. Our job is to help the creators, remove the obstacles to ongoing development and creation. And right now, encryption is under really serious threat. It's under threat internationally, and it's under threat in the United States. And so, especially for the folks here, I know there's a lot of blockchain folks in this audience. There is a fight going on in Congress where your voice is really needed. Because I think they think encryption is just something that bad guys use to, plan heists, and they don't realize the deep reliance that all of us have on the kind of security and reliability that encryption gives. So, our job is to get the obstacles out of the way for entrepreneurs. And, there are others as well. If we're going to talk more broadly about the distributed web and not just about encryption, there's a set of laws that are getting in people's ways right now. And I'd love to talk about those a little later. And probably some positive things we need to do to try to free things up, because we've become so worshiping of this platform model that we're really locking out the ways that you continue to innovate in this world. But, for us on the encryption side, the science, because encryption is just math, right? It's applied math. So you can't remove it from people's brains, right? So the bottom part of encryption, the very end of is kind of applied math. It's not all that hard. So the idea that you could erase people's brains and they wouldn't know about encryption anymore just makes people giggle. Me too. But what we need to do is we need to get all the other obstacles out of the way of people actually using it.
And Jim, your organization approaches this from I think a completely different perspective, which I love. So briefly talk about what is the Linux Foundation now that we've defined the kernel, and how are you sort of shepherding that openness? Do you feel that this openness is under attack? What roles do you and your team play to help ensure that the internet stays open?
Yeah, I mean, I love Cindy's description of staying out of the way. When Linus Torvalds created the Linux kernel, the plan for its development was that there is no plan, right? It was a sort of decentralized way for people to use it however they want. They would feed that feedback back into the system, improve it, and it would essentially through that cooperative mechanism take over almost every modern form of computing. Our organization's role is to facilitate and set up systems to allow that to happen in a trusted way. Whether it's making sure that we comply with export administration regulations, as Cindy pointed out, sending those emails and making sure that we are clear on what we're doing, whether it's defending the intellectual property of these major shared works that we all depend on, or just facilitating more rapid connection of the creative folks that get together. I think the important thing for our organization is whether it's Linux or Kubernetes, which is now the foundation of cloud computing, or Node.js, which is the world's largest server-side JavaScript, I guess what people use to create modern web applications and mobile device applications. We want to enable what we think is in human nature, which is empathy, selflessness, cooperation. And I think too often, and Yochai Benkler in his book, The Penguin and Leviathan, points this out so well. Too often we resort to what we know: selfishness, capitalism, punishment, money as a reward, and humans, and what we witness, and I'm fortunate to witness every day, they really want to work together. We ask developers all the time, why do you participate? I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands of developers that build the infrastructure for the internet. Why do you participate? Money is never the top of this list. Cooperation, mastering their craft, the joy of creation. Humans want to do this. We've been fortunate to set up systems so that we can do that on every layer of the important software that runs the internet. That has worked in a way that has enabled it financially, and we want to continue to do that. But I think staying out of the way, making sure that we set up systems so that that continues is certainly something we take seriously.
Thank you, Jim. And I want to put a bookmark in what you said about the relatively low priority of making money with a lot of the people that you work with, because this is about a business. This event is about business, right? So I do want to talk about that. But before we get to that, Cindy, you had mentioned some pending regulations or other issues that you wanted to talk about. And I'd love to give you a chance to kind of highlight that. What's going on nowadays that sort of has you concerned from a regulatory or legal perspective?
There's a couple of things. I mean, as I said, they are coming after encryption every single time. The last thing they tried to do was to tie liability for content that other people post to making sure that your system isn't secure by underlying encryption. There's a bill called Earn It, which is, kind of a double bad, double plus bad kind of thing. But so there's encryption, but there's also, I think that the theme of this conference is about, creating an open web and a distributed web. And there are 3 or 4 different legal systems that are really proving as blockers for people who want to interoperate with current systems, which I think is really an important piece of this. The idea that everybody's going to just leave the big tech giants is a bit problematic. I think what we need to do is to make them not so giant, make them a node on our giant distributed world of things. And the three laws that I want to talk about are the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is based on this property model that if you're interacting with somebody else's computer, you're kind of de facto doing something wrong, as opposed to doing something that fosters communication and interoperability. And we see it used against companies that are trying to interact all the time. The other one is the Digital Millennium Copyright Act anti-circumvention provisions. That's a mouthful. People talk about something called Section 1201, but this is, again, it's a blocker to interoperability that's based in copyright law and has been misused to stop people from building their own printer cartridges or building a garage door opener that interoperates with a garage door opener. I mean, it's been used in all sorts of ways, and now there's a lot of use of it in farming that I think are really problematic. And then the third one is contractual limitations on reverse engineering and interoperating. And those are three areas of the law that are right now obstacles to a lot of people who want to build a more distributed world without having to, silo themselves off from the rest of the world. And I think there are three things we need to take a really close look at. And then there's some affirmative things as well.
So for anyone who wasn't able to get those down quickly as Cindy was talking, please go visit her on Twitter, the EFF. They have all kinds of other information about that. I'd like to come back, Jim. I'm so glad that you brought up money. I love your passion about the goodness of humanity. I love your passion about our desire to cooperate and to work together and being an inherently social species. But I also do like the hat tip to money. Notably, though you said money was low on the list of priorities, it was not off the list of priorities. And fascinating conversation a little while ago about how much money is there to be made. The idea of putting all this work into a bunch of software and then giving it away is so counterintuitive to a lot of entrepreneurs. Is there money to be made in an open internet? Can you disrupt the big four the big four tech giants and still make money doing it?
Yeah, I mean, again, as an optimist, and I think you have to be in the job I have, I think people are inherently innovative. And if we can set up systems where we can build things that allow people to be social and cooperate, you can have your cake and eat it too. You can make money and work cooperatively and be open at the same time. And, I'm just a firsthand witness to this. Our organization, in every project that we've been hosting, sees billions of dollars in market cap made through startups that base a new company on an interesting new open source project. We see this software being used in amazing, innovative ways and, insurgent companies that come in. I think one of the things that has sort of caused consolidation in the tech sector is when we move to a services economy, CapEx and OpEx became a differentiator. When you have a collective $100 billion in CapEx being invested into cloud services, that's something that a startup can't compete with. I'm confident that people using open source can focus on that small part of innovation that will allow them to make money and give them the joy of cooperating on the software that they use with everybody else.
I love it. I love it. Virtual round of applause. Thank you so much. Both, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate your insights and your help preparing for the event. Looking forward to staying in touch down the road, and best of luck with your work.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.